Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to look at Manasseh and Amon in our continuing study, 2 Kings chapter 21. The previous chapter ends on chapter 20, verse 21. So Hezekiah slept with his fathers, and you'll remember that Hezekiah was a good king, a king that sought to bring people back to the Lord, to tear down the high places, to establish the temple as the place of worship. And Manasseh, his son, became king in his place. And so here's a good king followed by, well, somebody, frankly, who's not going to be a good king. Just because you follow the Lord is not necessarily a guarantee that your children are going to do so. Chapter 21, verse 1, Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. Now, that's rather young to be a king. However, to be fair, most scholars believe that there was a co-regency involved here. And I'm not going to try to go through the chronology. There are experts who have spent lots more hours on this than I have. But most think that there was a co-regency of quite a number of years, might have been as many as those 15 years that were given remember how Hezekiah was told, you're going to die, and then he prays, and then God says, well, you'll have an additional 15 years of life. And these might be the 15 years of life where from the time he's 12 years old up until the time he's an adult, that he is a co-regent with his father, a king in training. Notice, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hephzibah. And so when it comes to Israel and what we've been doing throughout our study of 1st and 2nd Kings, we've been comparing Israel and Judah, but Israel back in 721 BC had been carried off into captivity. There has been no more Israel. Hezekiah had seen that, but then notice those years continued, and now we have Manasseh, and notice I put the little segment on that little segment on the left where he is co-regent perhaps with his father, and now he is going to be reigning for quite a number of years. We've already seen prophets like Hosea and Isaiah and Micah during this time. Notice Isaiah's ministry comes to an end around the time that Manasseh is beginning his independent kingship, as once Hezekiah has died. And according to tradition, Isaiah is actually executed, is put to death by Manasseh as he's turning away from God, as Manasseh is turning away from God. We read this in verse 2. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. The very people that had been moved out of the land by God when the Israelites came into the land, that's the sort of example that Manasseh is following. Verse 3, for he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he erected altars for Baal. Baal is just the word Lord, but also refers to a pagan deity. You actually see a representation of him that has been found. Baal was considered to be the son of the greater god El, and he was sort of the storm god and the god of fertility and rain and things like that. And notice he also made an Asherah. This was again a pagan device that was used for the Canaanite religion. And notice he's following in the footsteps as Ahab, king of Israel, had done, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them. For the most part, we've seen that the kings of Israel even did not worship Baal. Usually that they were worshiping God, but in the wrong way. They were engaging in idolatry, using these calves that had been set up, golden calves in Bethel and in Dan, as a way to try to worship God, and God had forbidden that. But Ahab had gone a step further. Ahab had actually worshipped the pagan gods, turned completely away from worshiping God, and that's what Manasseh does. He is following in the footsteps of Ahab. Verse 4, he built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. The very place that was supposed to be holy to God, Manasseh builds pagan altars there. You're seeing a picture here of the pagan altar that was at Megiddo. I don't know if the one in Jerusalem looked like that. Notice it was the one in Megiddo was a very large altar. You can see the steps leading up to the surface of the altar, huge. Verse 5, so he built altars for all the hosts of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. So he desecrates the house of God, the temple, in order to build these pagan altars there. Notice for all the hosts of heaven, he's engaged in astrology of the worst kind. I'm not sure there is an astrology of the best kind. Verse 6, he made his son pass through the fire. And here he is alluding to the practice among the Canaanites and some of the Canaanite religions where they would take a child and engage in human sacrifice, put that child into the flames in the hands of their pagan god, as you see illustrated here by an artist. Practicing witchcraft. He used divination, trying to consult with departed spirits and other spirits, and dealt with mediums and spiritists. A great deal of what passes for spiritism, I think, is just fakery. But I think there are perhaps instances where people do engage in that sort of activity, not to necessarily to talk to somebody who has passed away. I'm not sure that they can do that, but rather they're engaging with demons. And this seems to be the case here. Notice he did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Verse 7, then he set the carved image of Asherah. Now, Asherah, that's a feminine word, so you had both male gods and female goddesses that he had made. And he places this also in the house of the Lord, in the house of which the Lord said to David and to his son Solomon, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of tribes of Israel, I'll put my name forever. The very place that God had set apart for worship to him, Manasseh turns it into, oh goodness, a collection of pagan gods. And we have actually found statues of these pagan gods in Judah, in Israel, not just from the time of the Canaanites, but also from later times when the Jews were there and supposed to be worshiping God alone without any recourse to such idolatry. Verse 9, but they did not listen, and Manasseh seduced them to do evil more than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the sons of Israel. He's not just copying the nations, he's advancing beyond them in his seduction. And notice that leaders can be seductive in seducing. Manasseh was a leader. But he's leading in a bad way. You can have a leader that leads, but he leads the wrong way. And Manasseh was such an evil leader that seduces his own people to do that which is wrong. We have from let me just go back and recap in verses 1 through 9. We've already read these. The sins of Manasseh worshiped Baal, and he brought pagan altars into the temple. He had his sons pass through the fire, practiced divination, set up the Asherah, that is these pagan goddesses. And then beginning in verse 10, God gives a series of warnings. He warns of calamity that's coming, that he's going to wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a plate. Now, this is in keeping with what God had promised back in Leviticus chapter 26, where God had said, look, if you worship me, if you follow me, I'm going to have your enemies run away from you. I'm going to be in the land, and it will be fertile, and your crops will grow, and your people will do wonderfully. But if you do not, I will bring all these curses. And one of these curses, he's going to wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a plate. He's going to abandon even the remnant. Now, what we've seen very oftentimes is a bad king comes along, or people start worshiping the wrong way, but there's a faithful remnant. And God says, I'm even going to abandon the remnant, and I will deliver them to their enemies. And we come to verses 16 through 18 that sort of gives the conclusion about how Manasseh shed much innocent blood. So there was not just religious idolatry, but also there were social sins against the people of the land. And so the guilty were encouraged to be guilty, and the innocent were punished as though they had been guilty. And we read that these things, there's more given even in the books of the Chronicles of the King. And he comes to an end, and he's buried in the garden of Uzzah. Verse 17, now the rest of the acts of Manasseh and all that he did and his sin which he committed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. And the book of Kings doesn't mention that Manasseh was actually carried off to Babylon by the king of Assyria. And it also does not mention that when he was taken away by the king of Assyria to Babylon, that in his deportation, in his exile, he repented and turned to the Lord and was released and came back into the land. And for a time, he actually did better. He tore down some of the high places and sought to reverse some of those bad things that he had done. Now, Kings doesn't mention that, so I'm not going to go into detail. Go read 2 Chronicles chapter 33 for the rest of that story. But Kings doesn't mention that, and you have to ask, why doesn't the books of Kings mention the fact that there was at least some sort of measure of repentance and a return? And perhaps it's because the path that Manasseh had begun the nation, the path away from God, was going to continue, at least for a time, unabated. And yes, he came to a later repentance, and I don't want to discount that, but it had diminishing returns. And there's perhaps a lesson here, especially when we come to the son of Manasseh, Amon, and in his case, it's going to be as though the repentance had not taken place at all. And so we read in verse 19, Amon was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 2 years in Jerusalem, a very short reign. And his mother's name was Meshullemeth, the daughter of Haruz of Jatbah. And we're going to see about Amon, like I said, very short reign, only a couple years, and I don't even have room to put the dates there. But we read verse 19, he did evil in the sight of the Lord as Manasseh his father had done, for he walked in the way that his father had walked. I'm not talking about the repentance, I'm talking about the sinfulness, and served the idols that his father had served and worshiped them. So he forsook the Lord, the God of his fathers, and did not walk in the way of the Lord. And you say, what about the repentance of Manasseh? And it's a lesson that sometimes when repentance comes late in life, the damage, especially to one's children, has already been laid and has already been done. And I'm not saying that God doesn't forgive, but the damage remains. And the legacy of unbelief and the legacy of unfaithfulness is too often passed to those children. And that's what we see here. Verse 23, the servants of Amon conspired against him. Now, we're not told why this took place, so I don't want to read anything into it. But it's a very dishonorable death to be. It's one thing to die of old age, long and full of days. It's another thing to be murdered, to be assassinated by your own servants. And these servants conspired against him and killed the king in his own house. Then the people of the land killed all those who had conspired against King Amon, and the people of the land made Josiah, his son, king in his place. So next we're going to see, and we'll see this in the next chapter, we'll see the story of Josiah. And Josiah will be the breath of fresh air that we wished Amon could have been. And so Josiah is going to come on the scene, and in his day we'll see a return and a repentance from the very beginning that brings us back to God. And of course, in his day, we're also going to see a prophet. And it will be the prophet, not at the beginning of his reign, but later on, the prophet Jeremiah. And so that these written prophets will continue to be heard and to be read, and God will call his people, at least for a time, back to repentance.